In this lecture, we're going to talk about the endocrine system. It consists of glands and tissues that will secrete hormones. Now, hormones are chemical messengers, so you can think of them as little messengers that move from one organ to another, or one from gland to an organ, or between neurons, which we've kind of already looked at before. Hormones are chemicals that affect the behavior of other glands or tissues, which can be located far away from the site of hormone production. So essentially, the endocrine system is going to be in control of a lot of the other systems. They're going to influence the function of a lot of the other systems in the body. Functions of hormones include regulation of the function of other organ systems, influencing cell metabolism. And remember, metabolism is the sum of all of the chemical reactions that take place in a cell. So this is what the cell takes in and what the cell gets rid of. Contributes to the growth and development of body parts, responds to stress, and also promotes cell division and mitosis through the presence of growth factors. The endocrine system involves the use of endocrine glands. Now, endocrine glands do not have ducts, tubes, or passageways that are used in the secretion of a substance, but instead, they will secrete their product directly into the interstitial fluid, the fluid that surrounds the cells, and then the hormones can then diffuse into the bloodstream for distribution throughout the body. Another method of endocrine glands is to be used right around the site of where the gland is. So these are called local hormones. These don't enter the bloodstream. They are just secreted and used right where they are secreted to affect neighboring cells. Both the nervous system and the endocrine system are involved with the maintenance of the body's homeostasis. The nervous system responds immediately, rapidly. We talked about how quickly some of those impulses can travel. But the endocrine system is a slower, prolonged response. If you've ever heard of anyone having to take synthetic hormones, it takes several months for those to get into the system to determine if they are going to be effective or not. And that's because the endocrine system does work very slowly. The production of hormones is controlled two ways. Number one is a negative feedback system. We've talked about this one before. This is a response in which the output of the product of a system will suppress or inhibit the activity of the system. So it slows it down or shuts it down totally. We gave the example of blood glucose levels. When you have a lot of glucose in your bloodstream, the pancreas will produce insulin, which tells the liver to begin to take glucose out of the bloodstream and store it as glycogen. The lowered blood glucose level then will prevent the pancreas from producing more insulin, so it stops the loop. Another way that hormones are used is by the release of an antagonistic hormone. For example, calcitonin is produced by your thyroid gland, which we'll talk more about in just a minute, and it functions to lower blood calcium levels, but the parathyroid gland secretes a hormone that actually increases blood calcium levels. So when we talk about an antagonistic hormone, we're talking about one that works against another one. Most hormones can fall into two basic chemical classes. One is peptide hormones that target specific cells of the body. They will have receptors on the cell membrane surface that allows for sensitivity regulation. So the more receptors that are present on the cell membrane, then the higher the sensitivity level. An example of that is epinephrine. Epinephrine will bind to a receptor on muscle cells, which will cause ATP, which we know is the energy molecule, to be converted to a cyclic AMP, which we call CAMP for short. So in this case, the epinephrine functions as a first messenger. The CAMP refers to as a second messenger. CAMP will then begin an enzyme cascade in which every step leads to more reactions. So it's a set of reactions, one right after the other. In muscle cells, the activation of these signals by epinephrine will lead to the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. And this diagram shows you the first messenger initiating the response by binding to the receptor, which causes the second messenger to then carry out the activity. Second, we have steroid hormones. These bind to receptors in the cytoplasm or the nucleus as opposed to the cell membrane. They will then diffuse through the cell membrane to reach the inside of the cell. Hormone receptors will bind to DNA and activate transcription and translation of certain genes, resulting in the formation of the appropriate enzyme. If you've had Principles of Biology 1, you may recall that transcription and translation are the two steps of protein synthesis. So essentially what is happening here is it's activating protein synthesis to make the enzyme that is needed. Remember, enzymes are proteins. And enzymes would then help to carry out the desired response. Because it takes longer to make new proteins than to activate enzymes that are already there, steroid hormones act more slowly than peptide hormones, but their actions will last longer. This diagram shows you the steroid hormone as it crosses the plasma membrane into the cell. So you can see that here, crossing the plasma membrane. It binds to the receptor, forming this complex. Then it enters the nucleus, where it will initiate transcription, the first step in protein synthesis, to make that enzyme. The first set of structures we're going to talk about with the endocrine system are the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. These help regulate the internal environment in two ways. Number one, through the autonomic nervous system, it will regulate heartbeat, blood pressure, water balance, hunger, your appetite, by controlling the glandular secretions of the pituitary gland, which is connected to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus not only works through the autonomic nervous system, but it also helps control another gland called the pituitary. The hypothalamus will produce two hormones that pass through the axons of neurons into the posterior part of the pituitary gland. And these are controlled by positive feedback, which means the product will enhance the loop, making it occur again. Number one is an antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, which regulates salt-water balance. And the second one is oxytocin. And this causes contractions in the uterus during childbirth and causes milk letdown when a baby is nursing. The hypothalamus controls the anterior part of the pituitary through the production of hormones. 4 of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary can have effects on other glands, and examples of these are TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, and gonadotropic hormones such as FSH, which stands for follicular stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. Those last two, FSH and LH, are reproductive system hormones. Other hormones produced by the anterior pituitary don't affect other endocrine glands, and this is like prolactin. It is only produced during pregnancy and after childbirth. It's involved in milk production and the suppression of ovulation in the nursing mother. And then growth hormone, which promotes growth, obviously, in the skeletal and muscular system, increases the rate of protein synthesis because proteins, a lot of proteins are structural, so they're going to be used for that growth and maintenance of tissues, and also promotes fat metabolism. The thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland are next. You can see a picture of the thyroid gland here in this diagram. It is located at the base of the neck in front of the trachea, which is your windpipe. Excuse me. The thyroid gland is a large gland responsible for acquiring iodine in the bloodstream. So you have to have a certain amount of iodine in your diet. Most of us get plenty of iodine because our salt is iodized. When you buy iodized salt, it has iodine added to it. And as Americans, we get plenty of salt in our diet. So usually we don't have a problem with this. But it uses the iodine to produce hormones called T3 and T4, which increase metabolism in the body. If you have the disorder hypothyroidism, hypo means low, so you have low levels of these thyroid hormones, and you may not metabolize your food as well, which means you may take on fat, may gain weight, and you may not have a lot of energy, as opposed to hyperthyroidism. Hyper means higher, so that means you have an overactive thyroid, and you can take hormones synthetically to regulate these glands. The thyroid also produces calcitonin, which helps control blood calcium levels, which are used at nerve conduction. We saw that in the nerve impulses. Muscle contraction, we've studied that, and also in blood clotting. The parathyroid glands are 4 small glands that lie on the back side, the dorsal side of the thyroid. So this is a picture of the back view, the dorsal view of the thyroid. You can see the 4 yellow parathyroid glands there that produce parathyroid hormones, which function to increase calcium levels in the blood. Next are the adrenal glands. They are found above each kidney, so you have a pair of these. They consist of an inner adrenal medulla on the inside and an outer adrenal cortex. The medulla is controlled by the hypothalamus. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, it gives you that rush of energy, and norepinephrine are produced by the adrenal medulla and are responsible for a response known as fight or flight. This is the response that initiates during an emergency. So again, we've talked about this before, I believe, but when someone shows superior strength, like they can pick up a car off of someone during an emergency, it's because of these hormones being produced during that emergency time. The adrenal cortex provides a longer-term response to stress through the production of mineralocorticoids, which regulate salt and water, and in turn affect blood pressure, and 2, by the production of glucocorticoids, which are involved in carbohydrate, protein, and fat metabolism. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid which promotes the breakdown of proteins into amino acids. Amino acids are taken up from the bloodstream and converted to glucose by the liver, so it's essentially the metabolism of proteins. Cortisol also promotes the metabolism of fatty acids and is used to counteract the inflammatory response. If you know of anyone who has an arthritis and they go get a shot when they have a flare-up, they are receiving a cortisone shot, a cortisone injection. It's used for decreasing inflammation of the joints. Mineralocorticoids include aldosterone and renin. As examples, aldosterone is the most important of the two. It promotes the absorption of sodium and the excretion of potassium ions by the kidney, which regulates blood pressure. And renin is secreted when blood sodium levels are low, stimulates the secretion of aldosterone. So those two kind of work hand in hand. The next gland is the pancreas. You're probably a little more familiar with the pancreas because of its insulin production. It is a long organ surrounded by the stomach, spleen, liver, and the duodenum of the small intestines. You can see it here on this diagram. It's lying dorsal to the stomach, dorsal and inferior to the stomach. It is made of both exocrine and endocrine tissues. Clusters of endocrine cells called islets of Langerhans produce the insulin and glucagon and somatostatin. What are these used for? Well, number one, insulin is secreted when you get a lot of glucose in your blood. So when you eat a meal, you're taking in glucose. That glucose it enters the bloodstream, so you have high glucose levels in the blood, causing the pancreas to secrete insulin. This insulin stimulates liver cells and muscle cells and fat cells to absorb glucose from the bloodstream. So you got lots of glucose in the bloodstream. Pancreas says, oh, I better secrete some insulin and get this glucose out of the bloodstream, so cells begin to take up the glucose and store it as glycogen and fat. Glucagon kind of does the opposite. This is when blood glucose levels are very low. So it will take the glycogen and then break it back down into glucose for our cells to use. So in this way, it functions to raise glucose levels in the blood. This is a diagram that shows you these two scenarios. Here we have low blood glucose. So then the pancreas would start to secrete hormones that cause, glucagon is released that causes the liver to release glucose into the blood to raise glucose levels. But if you have high blood glucose, it's going to secrete insulin that's going to cause cells to begin to take glucose out of the blood, again lowering the levels of glucose. And so this is one way that it maintains homeostasis. It's trying to achieve normal blood glucose levels. The next set we're going to talk about are the testes and ovaries. Testes in males and ovaries in females are collectively known as the gonads. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are going to control the secretions of these organs. One of the hormones secreted by these organs is the testosterone. This is produced during puberty and stimulates the growth of the penis and the testes in the male, brings about and maintains secondary sex characteristics such as hair growth. Estrogen is secreted during puberty in females and stimulates the growth of the uterus and the vagina. It is also necessary for the egg to mature into an ovum, which is capable of fertilization, and for secondary sex characteristics such as body hair and fat distribution. Both estrogen and another hormone called progesterone are responsible for breast development and regulation of the uterine cycle, the menstrual cycle. The next gland is the thymus, not to be confused with the thyroid. So the thyroid was in this general area underneath the trachea. So the thymus gland is going to be lying inferior to this and just behind, just deep to the sternum, the breastbone. This gland is most active during childhood. It gets smaller with age, and it becomes more fatty with age. Lymphocytes produced in the bone marrow will travel to the thymus to mature and to differentiate into different types of cells. In this case, traveling to the thymus gland will produce T lymphocytes or T cells used for immunity. The pineal gland. This is located in the brain. You can see it right here. It's just a very small, see if I can do this, very small gland here, pineal gland, and it produces melatonin. Melatonin is the sleep hormone. So this is involved in your circadian rhythms, your daily sleep-wake cycle. You can take synthetic melatonin if you have trouble going to sleep at night. You can get this in drops form that go on your tongue, liquid, or in pill form. It's supposed to help stimulate sleep. Other hormones worth mentioning are leptin. This is produced by adipose tissue, and it acts on the hypothalamus to tell your brain that you are full. This one, again, is a slow-acting hormone, which is why it is beneficial for us to take our time on meals, because we could eat and eat and eat and eat and eat so fast that we're overstuffed before leptin is able to tell our brain that we're full in the first place. So it's important for us to give time for this hormone to act. Growth factors are other hormones that will help stimulate cell division, and then prostaglandins are produced from fatty acids. They act on local tissues such as the uterus, where they would then cause contractions. And that concludes our lecture on the endocrine system.